Financial contributor only. That's what the screen said when my name appeared above a photo of my parents smiling, their hands intertwined as if they had built everything together, as if I had never existed beyond the checks I wrote. And the room filled with soft laughter, the kind people think is harmless, the kind that cuts deeper because it pretends not to. And I stood there in my navy blue dress, the one I had carefully chosen for their 40th wedding anniversary, smiling just enough to look composed, just enough to keep my dignity intact while something inside me shifted quietly, permanently. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end and tell me where you're watching from. Because I need someone out there to understand how a moment like this doesn't just happen. It builds, slowly, over years, in ways you don't notice until it's too late. The ballroom at the Grand Lakeside Hotel was exactly how my mother had described it when she asked if I could help a little with the arrangements. Crystal chandeliers casting warm light across linen-covered tables, white roses in tall vases, a string quartet playing softly near the stage, everything elegant, everything perfect, everything paid for. And as I stood near the back of the room, I watched guests raise their glasses, complimenting the decor, praising the evening, and I nodded politely when they thanked me, because of course they assumed I was just another guest, not the one who had covered the deposits, the catering, the live music, the custom cake that sat proudly at the center of the room like a symbol of something I was no longer part of. I adjusted the bracelet on my wrist, a simple gold piece my husband had given me years ago before he passed, and I told myself it didn't matter, that tonight was about them, that I had always believed family celebrations were meant to be joyful, meant to bring people together, and for a moment, I tried to hold on to that belief, even as I noticed the way my son, Daniel, avoided my gaze. Moving through the crowd with effortless charm, his hand resting lightly on Sophia's back as she laughed with their friends, her blonde hair catching the light, her smile polished and perfect, the kind of smile that looks warm until you realize it never quite reaches the eyes. I had seen that smile before, over dinners, over holidays, over quiet conversations where decisions were made without me, where my role slowly shifted from mother to something less defined, something more convenient. And I told myself I was imagining things, that families change, that children grow up and build their own lives, that it was natural to feel a little left behind sometimes. But tonight felt different. Tonight there was a clarity to it, a sharpness I couldn't ignore. I moved closer to one of the tables, pretending to admire the floral arrangements, when I overheard a woman's voice, light, amused. "Did you see the screen earlier?" she said. "I heard they put that as a joke," and another voice replied, "Well, it makes sense. Someone had to pay for all this." They both laughed softly, and I felt my fingers tighten around the edge of the tablecloth, just for a second, before I forced myself to relax, to breathe, to remain composed, because causing a scene would only confirm whatever quiet narrative had already been written about me. The overly sensitive mother, the one who doesn't know when to step back. And I wasn't going to give them that. Not tonight. I straightened my posture and made my way toward the bar, each step measured, controlled, as if I were walking through something fragile that might shatter if I moved too quickly. And that's when Daniel finally approached me, his expression neutral, almost polite. "Mom," he said, as if we hadn't spoken in weeks, as if we weren't standing in a room I had helped create. "You made it." I smiled. "Of course I did. I wouldn't miss it." He nodded, glancing briefly over his shoulder where Sophia stood, watching us with that same careful smile. And for a moment, there was silence, the kind that stretches just long enough to feel intentional, just long enough to say everything that isn't being said. "It looks beautiful," I added, meaning the event, meaning the effort, meaning everything I had contributed without acknowledgement. "Yeah," Daniel replied. "It turned out great. Sophia really handled everything." And there it was, simple, casual, almost offhand, but heavy enough to settle into my chest like something final. I followed his gaze to where she stood, accepting compliments, thanking guests, owning the evening as if it had always belonged to her. And I realized then that the screen, the label, the laughter, none of it was accidental. It was deliberate, curated, a quiet redefinition of my place in this family, not as a mother, not as someone who had spent decades building, sacrificing, supporting, but as something smaller, something easier to dismiss. I took a slow sip of water, my hands steady, my expression unchanged, and I nodded. I'm glad she's happy, I said. Because that's what you say when you understand that happiness, in this room, no longer includes you. Daniel smiled, relieved, maybe, that I wasn't making this difficult, and he excused himself, already turning back toward the life he had chosen, the one where I existed only on the edges, and I stood there for a moment longer, listening to the music, watching the lights reflect off the glassware, feeling the weight of the necklace around my neck, the one my husband had given me on our 25th anniversary, a reminder of a time when I had been seen, valued, loved without conditions, and I reached up slowly, my fingers brushing against it, not to adjust it this time, but to understand something I hadn't fully allowed myself to accept until now, that sometimes the most painful realizations don't come from what people say to your face, but from what they're comfortable saying about you when they think you're no longer important enough to hear it. And as I stood there in that room I had helped build, surrounded by people who barely noticed me, I felt something settle into place, not anger, not sadness, but something quieter, something colder, something that told me this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the moment everything finally became clear. I did not leave the ballroom right away, not yet, because walking out too soon would have meant admitting that what happened on that screen mattered more than I was willing to show. So I stayed, just long enough to see the rest of the evening unfold the way they had planned it, just long enough to understand exactly where I stood, and I moved through the room slowly, stopping when spoken to, smiling when expected, my voice calm and measured in every response. Because that is what you learn after a lifetime of keeping peace. You learn how to make your pain invisible, how to carry it quietly so no one feels uncomfortable. And yet the longer I stayed, the more I began to notice things I had overlooked before, small details that, once seen, could not be unseen, like the seating chart near the entrance where every table was carefully labeled with names written in elegant script, except mine was nowhere to be found. Not even at the table reserved for immediate family, and I traced the list once, then twice, as if repetition might change the outcome, as if I might suddenly discover that this had all been a misunderstanding. But it was not. It was precise, intentional, and complete. I stepped away before anyone could notice, before anyone could offer an explanation that would only make it worse, and I chose an empty seat near the back of the room. One of the few places where I could observe without being observed, and from there I watched as the evening moved forward, speeches began, glasses were raised, laughter filled the air, and when my father stood up to speak, his voice steady, his words rehearsed, I listened carefully, waiting, perhaps foolishly, for some acknowledgement, some small mention that might suggest I still belonged to this story, but he spoke of love, of partnership, of the life he and my mother had built together. He thanked friends, colleagues, even distant relatives, and when he finally mentioned family, it was brief, general, and carefully phrased in a way that included everyone and no one at the same time. And I felt something settle deeper inside me, not a sharp pain, but a quiet understanding that this was not an oversight. This was a decision. And decisions like this are rarely made in a single moment. They are built over time, reinforced through silence, through avoidance, through conversations that happen without you. I folded my hands in my lap, keeping them still, because even the smallest movement felt too loud in that moment, and I let my gaze drift across the room again until it landed on Sophia, who was standing beside Daniel, her posture perfect, her attention fixed on the stage, but every so often her eyes moved, scanning the room, calculating, and when they briefly met mine, she did not look away immediately. She held my gaze for just a second longer than necessary, and in that second there was no warmth, no apology, only confirmation, and she offered a small smile, polite, controlled, the kind that acknowledges your presence without granting you any real importance. And then she turned back to the conversation beside her, as if I had already been dismissed. I exhaled slowly, steadying myself, reminding myself that I had lived through harder things than this, that I had built a life from very little, that I had raised a son on my own after my husband passed, working long hours, making sacrifices that no one in this room would ever fully understand, and I had never expected repayment, never demanded recognition, but I had believed, perhaps naively, that respect would come naturally, that it would not need to be negotiated or earned again and again, and yet here I was, sitting at the edge of a celebration I had helped create, realizing that respect had quietly been replaced with something else entirely, something transactional, something that reduced me to a role that could be acknowledged or ignored depending on what was convenient. The applause brought me back to the present. The speech had ended, and the room shifted into a lighter mood. Music grew louder, people stood, conversations resumed, and Daniel approached the stage, taking the microphone with an ease that suggested he had practiced this moment. He began to speak about the future, about new beginnings, about the importance of moving forward, and his words were met with nods and smiles. And then he laughed softly, making a comment about how every generation has to know when to step aside and let the next one take over, and the room responded with polite laughter, but something about the way he said it, something about the timing, made it land differently, made it feel less like a general statement and more like a message, and I felt the weight of it settle around me, not heavy enough to crush, but firm enough to hold me in place, and I realized then that staying any longer would not change anything. It would only allow more of these moments to unfold, more quiet confirmations of what had already been made clear. So I reached up again, my fingers brushing against the necklace at my throat, feeling the familiar shape of it, the small imperfections that only I would notice. And I thought about the man who had given it to me, about the life we had built together, about the years when I had not questioned my place, when I had not needed to prove my worth. And I let that memory ground me, steady me, because what I was about to do was not impulsive. It was not driven by anger. It was something far more deliberate, something that had been forming long before tonight. I stood up quietly, smoothing the fabric of my dress, making sure every movement remained controlled, composed, and I placed the necklace gently on the table in front of me, not as a gesture for anyone else, but as a quiet acknowledgement to myself, a marker of a moment that would not be undone. And as I turned toward the exit, I did not look back, not at the stage, not at the people, not even at my son, because some endings do not need witnesses, they only need certainty. And with each step I took toward the doors, the distance between who I had been to them and who I was about to become grew clearer, sharper, until the noise of the ballroom faded behind me, and all that remained was the sound of my own footsteps, steady, unhurried, carrying me forward into something they had never expected and would not understand until it was far too late. The night air outside the Grand Lakeside Hotel felt colder than it should have for early spring, but I welcomed it, because it was honest. It did not pretend to be warm while quietly pushing me out, and I stood there for a moment on the wide stone steps, my heels resting against the edge as the doors closed behind me, muting the music, the laughter, the carefully curated celebration that no longer had anything to do with me. And for the first time that evening, I allowed myself to exhale fully, not in relief, but in recognition that something irreversible had just happened, something that could not be explained away tomorrow with polite apologies or convenient misunderstandings, and I descended the steps slowly, each one deliberate, as if I were stepping out of one life and into another. And by the time I reached the curb, the valet approached with a courteous smile, asking if I needed my car, and I shook my head, because I had not driven myself tonight. I had arrived expecting to leave with family, and the thought settled quietly in my mind. Another small detail that now felt significant. I am fine, I told him, my voice steady, and I began walking, not with any clear destination, but with the certainty that I needed distance, physical distance, from that building, from that room, from everything it represented. The street was lined with soft amber lights, their glow stretching across the pavement, and the sound of my footsteps echoed faintly, measured and calm. And as I walked, memories began to surface, not all at once, but in fragments, moments I had dismissed before, conversations that had seemed harmless at the time, decisions made without my input, invitations that arrived late or not at all, holidays where I was present but not included. And I realized how carefully I had avoided connecting those moments, how I had chosen to believe in coincidence instead of intention, because believing otherwise would have required me to face a truth I was not ready to accept, that I had been gradually moved out of my own place in this family, not by accident, but by design. I paused at the corner, waiting for the light to change, and I caught my reflection in the dark glass of a storefront window. The woman staring back at me looked composed, even elegant, her posture straight, her expression calm. But there was something different in her eyes now, something clearer, sharper, as if the uncertainty that had once lived there had finally been replaced with understanding. And I wondered briefly when that change had begun, whether it started tonight or years ago, quietly, without announcement. I continued walking, my mind returning to Daniel, to the boy he used to be, the one who would run to me after school, eager to tell me about his day, the one who would sit at the kitchen table while I worked late into the night, pretending not to be tired because he wanted to stay close. And I remembered the promises I made to him then, that I would always be there, that I would give him every opportunity one could, that I would build something stable, something lasting. And I had kept those promises. I had worked 2 jobs when I needed to. I had sacrificed things he would never even know about. I had put his needs before my own without hesitation, because that is what you do when you love someone. You give without keeping score. You trust that what you are building together will hold. And yet somewhere along the way, that foundation had been rewritten, not erased, but repurposed, turned into something that could be acknowledged when convenient and dismissed when it was not. I reached the small park across the street from the hotel and stepped onto the path, the grass still damp from the evening, the air carrying the faint scent of water from the nearby lake. And I found a bench near the edge, sitting down slowly, allowing myself a moment of stillness. And in that stillness, the events of the night replayed again, but this time without the confusion, without the hesitation, only clarity, the screen, the label, the laughter, the seating chart, the speeches, the way Sophia held my gaze without apology, the way Daniel spoke about stepping aside, each piece fitting into place with a precision that was almost unsettling. And I realized that what hurt the most was not the public humiliation, not the subtle comments or the careful exclusions. It was the understanding that none of it had required a confrontation, none of it had needed to be said directly, because the message had already been delivered in every choice they made, in every decision that did not include me, in every moment where I was present but no longer considered. I folded my hands together, resting them in my lap, and for the first time, I allowed myself to consider what came next, not in terms of reaction, not as a response to what they had done, but as a decision of my own, independent, deliberate. And I thought about the house, about the accounts, about the documents I had signed over the years without much thought, trusting that everything was as it should be. And a quiet realization began to take shape, one that did not come with anger, but with purpose, because if tonight had shown me anything, it was that the story I believed we were living was not the one they were telling. And if that was true, then it was time for me to decide how my part of that story would end. I looked out over the lake, the surface still and reflective, mirroring the lights from the hotel behind me. And I sat there for a while longer, not rushing, not forcing anything, just allowing the weight of the moment to settle into something I could carry, something I could use. And when I finally stood up, the hesitation that had followed me out of that ballroom was gone, replaced with something steadier, something that did not need validation or approval. And as I turned away from the water and began walking again, I knew that the next steps I took would not be about returning to what had been, but about moving forward into something they had never anticipated, something they would only begin to understand when it was far too late to change it. By the time I reached my house, the sky had shifted into that quiet shade between night and morning, the kind of stillness that makes everything feel suspended, as if the world itself is waiting for something to change. And I stood at the front door for a moment longer than necessary, my hand resting lightly on the handle, not because I did not want to go inside, but because I understood that once I did, I would no longer be the same woman who had walked out of that ballroom. I would be someone who had seen clearly, and that kind of clarity does not allow you to return to comfort. I stepped inside, closing the door gently behind me, and the familiar scent of my home wrapped around me, soft, quiet, unchanged. And yet everything felt different. The living room was exactly as I had left it that morning. The throw blanket folded neatly over the arm of the sofa, the lamp casting a warm glow in the corner, the framed photographs lining the shelves, moments frozen in time, smiling faces, birthdays, holidays, a younger version of Daniel with his arm around me, his expression open, trusting, a time when I never questioned where I stood in his life. I walked slowly toward those frames, my fingers brushing lightly against the glass, and I paused at one from years ago, taken in this very house. Daniel, sitting at the kitchen table, his homework spread out in front of him, looking up at me with that familiar half-smile, the one that used to mean everything was still simple, still honest, and I tried to reconcile that boy with the man I had seen tonight, the one who spoke carefully, who avoided my eyes, who allowed someone else to redefine me without protest, and for a moment, there was a quiet ache, not sharp, not overwhelming, but steady, like something that had been there all along, waiting to be acknowledged. I set the frame back in its place and moved through the house, turning off lights, not out of habit, but because the darkness felt more fitting, more honest than the artificial brightness of the evening I had just left behind. And when I reached my bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed, the silence settling around me, not empty, but full of everything I had not allowed myself to think about until now. And I let my mind go back, not just to tonight, but to the months, the years that led up to it. Moments that once felt insignificant now rising to the surface with a clarity I could no longer ignore, like the time Sophia suggested that it would be easier if she handled the family finances, framing it as a way to take some pressure off. And I had agreed without hesitation, trusting that it was simply part of their life together. Or the time Daniel mentioned casually that he had updated certain documents, simplifying things, making everything more efficient, and I had nodded, believing that efficiency was a good thing, that change was natural, never once considering what those changes might actually mean. And I remembered the holidays that grew smaller, more controlled, where invitations came with conditions, where conversations felt rehearsed, where decisions had already been made before I was even aware there was something to decide, and each memory settled in a place like a piece of a pattern I had refused to see, not because it was hidden, but because I did not want to believe it was intentional. Because accepting that would mean accepting that I had allowed it, that I had been slowly stepping back while convincing myself it was my choice. I leaned back, slightly, resting against the headboard, my hands folded in my lap, and I closed my eyes for a moment, not to escape, but to focus, to separate emotion from understanding, because what I needed now was not to feel, but to think, to consider what had been done and what still remained within my control. And when I opened my eyes again, the room felt different, not unfamiliar, but clearer, as if the uncertainty that once filled it had been replaced with something more precise, more defined, and I reached for the small drawer in my nightstand, pulling it open slowly. Inside were documents I had not looked at in years, papers that represented decisions made during a different time, a different understanding of what family meant, and I lifted them carefully, placing them on the bed beside me, not with urgency, but with intention, because this was not about reacting to what had happened tonight. It was about responding to what had been building for far longer than I had allowed myself to admit. I picked up the first document, scanning the familiar lines, the names, the signatures, and I noticed details I had overlooked before, small clauses, conditions that once seemed standard now carrying a weight I had not considered. And I felt a quiet shift in my perspective, not of regret, but of awareness. Because understanding changes everything. It transforms what feels like loss into something else entirely, something that can be examined, adjusted, redirected. I set the paper down and reached for my phone, holding it in my hand for a moment before unlocking the screen, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number I had not needed in years, a name that represented a different part of my life, a time when decisions were made carefully, deliberately, with foresight rather than assumption. And I hesitated for only a second before saving it to my recent calls, not dialing yet, not tonight, because tonight was for clarity, not action, but I knew that would change soon. I placed the phone back on the nightstand and stood up, moving toward the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see the faint outline of the street outside, quiet, unchanged, as if nothing in the world had shifted, and I realized how easily life continues. How moments that feel monumental to us can pass unnoticed by everything else. And yet those moments are the ones that define what comes next. And as I stood there, looking out into that quiet street, I understood that tonight had not taken something from me. It had given me something I had been missing for a long time, a clear understanding of where I stood and what needed to be done. And I let the curtain fall back into place, turning away from the window, from the past, and towards something that would not be shaped by their decisions anymore, but by mine. The next morning arrived quietly, without announcement. as if the world had decided there was no need to acknowledge what had changed, and I woke before the sun had fully risen, not out of habit, but because sleep had come lightly, interrupted not by worry, but by a steady stream of thoughts that refused to be ignored any longer. And I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft ticking of the clock on my nightstand, letting the silence settle into something I could work with rather than something I needed to escape from. Because for the first time in a long while, the silence did not feel empty. It felt clear, and clarity has a way of demanding action, even when that action is quiet. Even when it begins with something as simple as getting out of bed and making a decision about how the day will unfold. I moved through my morning slowly, deliberately, making coffee the same way I always had, measuring each scoop, pouring the water carefully, watching the steam rise as if it were the only thing in the room that needed my attention. But beneath that routine, there was something different, something more focused, and when I sat down at the kitchen table with my cup in both hands, I did not reach for the newspaper. I did not turn on the television. Instead, I allowed my thoughts to settle on the one thing I had avoided for too long, the reality of what had been done, not just last night, but over time, in layers, in decisions that had slowly shifted control away from me, while making it appear as though everything was still exactly as it should be. I thought about the documents on my bed, about the signatures I had given without hesitation, about the trust one had placed in the idea of family, and I understood now that trust, when left unexamined, can become something else entirely, something that others can shape to their advantage without ever having to confront you directly. I set my cup down gently and stood up, walking back to my bedroom with the same steady pace I had carried since leaving the hotel, and when I reached the bed, the papers were exactly where I had left them, waiting, unchanged, but no longer overlooked. I gathered them carefully, stacking them in order, not rushing, not reacting, but reviewing, line by line, name by name, allowing myself to see what I had once chosen not to see. And the more I read, the clearer it became that what had happened was not sudden. It was structured, built through small adjustments that seemed harmless on their own, but, when combined, created something far more significant, something that placed control firmly in hands that were not mine. And I felt no anger as I realized this, only a quiet acknowledgement that I had been operating under an assumption that no longer held true. And assumptions, once broken, cannot be restored. They can only be replaced with something more accurate, more intentional. I placed the papers into a folder and carried them back to the kitchen, setting them down beside my coffee, which had gone slightly cold, but I did not mind, because this was not about comfort, it was about understanding. And once I had everything in front of me, I reached for my phone again, this time without hesitation, scrolling directly to the number I had saved the night before. And when I pressed call, the sound of it ringing felt louder than it should have, not because it was unexpected, but because it marked the first outward step in a process that had been forming quietly within me. The line connected on the third ring, and a familiar voice answered, calm, professional, unchanged by time, and I introduced myself without embellishment, stating my name clearly, explaining that I needed to review and possibly revise certain legal and financial arrangements. And there was a brief pause on the other end, not of confusion, but of recognition, as if this request was not entirely surprising, as if there had always been an understanding that a moment like this might come. And we spoke briefly, setting a time to meet later that day, not weeks from now, not after consideration, but today, because I had already spent enough time waiting, enough time allowing things to unfold without my involvement. And when the call ended, I felt something settle into place, not relief, but direction, and direction has a way of removing doubt. Even when the outcome is not yet fully known, I returned to my seat and took another sip of coffee, now lukewarm, and I let my gaze move across the kitchen, taking in the details I had once associated with comfort, with stability, with a life that felt secure. And I realized that security, when built on incomplete understanding, is not security at all. It is simply the absence of awareness. And now that I was aware, everything had shifted, not outwardly, not in a way that anyone else would notice yet, but internally, in a way that would shape every decision moving forward. I gathered my things with quiet efficiency, placing the folder into my bag, checking that everything I needed was in place, and when I finally stepped outside again, the sun had fully risen, casting a clear light across the street, illuminating everything without distortion, without shadow, and I paused for just a moment before walking toward my car, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, because this was the point where thought became action, where understanding became choice, and as I drove away from the house, I did not look back, not because I was leaving something behind, but because I was moving towards something that required my full attention, something that would not be shaped by what had been done to me, but by what I chose to do next. And for the first time since the night before, there was no question about whether I was doing the right thing, only a quiet certainty that I was finally doing something that was entirely my own. The law office was exactly as I remembered it, quiet in a way that felt intentional, the kind of quiet that does not come from emptiness but from order, from years of careful decisions being made behind closed doors. And as I stepped inside, the scent of polished wood and paper greeted me with a familiarity I had not realized I missed, because this place had once represented something important in my life, a time when every choice was made with thought, with clarity, with purpose, not out of assumption or trust alone, but out of understanding. And I paused just inside the doorway for a moment, taking it all in, the clean lines of the furniture, the soft light filtering through tall windows, the steady rhythm of footsteps somewhere down the hall, and it grounded me in a way that the past few days had not, because here, things were not implied, they were defined, written, signed, acknowledged, and that was exactly what I needed now. I approached the reception desk, giving my name calmly, and within minutes I was led into an office that felt both familiar and distant, as if time had passed, but nothing essential had changed. And when he entered, there was no surprise in his expression, only recognition, the kind that comes from someone who has seen patterns repeat over years, who understands that people often return when something has shifted beyond what they can manage on their own. And we exchanged brief greetings, polite, professional, and then I placed the folder on the desk between us, not dramatically, not with emphasis, just a simple motion that carried more meaning than I needed to explain. I told him I wanted everything reviewed, every document, every account, every transfer that had been made over the years, and he nodded. Without interruption, opening the folder carefully, scanning the pages with a practiced eye that moved quickly but did not miss detail. And as he read, I watched his expression, not expecting reaction, but looking for confirmation, something that would tell me whether what I had begun to understand on my own was accurate. And when he finally looked up, there was a pause, brief but deliberate, as if he were choosing his words with precision, and he explained that what I had signed over time had indeed shifted control, not entirely, not irreversibly, but enough to create a structure where decisions could be made without my direct involvement, enough to give others authority that I had not fully considered when I agreed to it. And I listened without interruption, my hands resting calmly in my lap, because none of this surprised me anymore. It only confirmed what I had already begun to see, and I asked him, simply, what could be changed, what could be adjusted, what remained within my control, and his answer was measured, careful, outlining options that required attention, timing, and above all, intention, because nothing in this situation could be undone with a single action. It would require a series of steps, each one deliberate, each one documented, each one shifting things back into alignment with what I wanted, not what had been assumed on my behalf. And as he spoke, I felt that same quiet clarity settle deeper within me, because this was not about reclaiming something lost. It was about redefining what had never been clearly protected in the first place. I nodded as he explained the process, the necessary reviews, the adjustments to be made, the meetings that would follow, and I agreed to each step without hesitation, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary, and necessity has a way of removing doubt. We spent the next hour going through details, names, dates, figures that once felt abstract now taking on clear meaning, and with each page, each explanation, the picture became sharper, more complete, until there was no longer any uncertainty about what had been done and what needed to be done next. And when we finished, he gathered the documents carefully, setting aside what needed immediate attention, marking what would require further review, and he assured me that the process would begin right away, that nothing would move forward without my direct approval from this point on. And that assurance did not feel like comfort. It felt like correction, like something being set back into its proper place after being quietly shifted over time. I stood up then, smoothing my jacket, not out of nervous habit, but because the action itself felt like part of a transition, a movement from one state of being to another, and we exchanged a final nod, not overly formal, not overly familiar, just an acknowledgement that something had begun, something that would not be undone. And as I stepped back out into the hallway, the quiet of the office no longer felt distant. It felt aligned with where I was now, steady, controlled, intentional. And when I exited the building, the afternoon light was bright, clear, casting sharp lines across the pavement, and I paused for just a moment before walking to my car, not because I was uncertain, but because I recognized that this was the point where everything I had understood, everything I had decided, was now set into motion. And as I drove away, there was no urgency in my movements, no need to rush, because what I had started did not require speed, it required consistency, and for the first time in a long while, I felt that every step ahead of me would be taken on my terms, not shaped by expectation, not influenced by quiet assumptions, but guided by a clarity that would not allow me to be placed in the background again. And somewhere in the back of my mind, there was a quiet awareness that the consequences of these decisions would eventually reach them, not immediately, not in a way they could anticipate, but in a way that would be unmistakable when it arrived. And I did not dwell on that thought. I simply let it exist, because this was not about them anymore. This was about me finally understanding the value of what I had built and deciding, with complete certainty, how it would be protected moving forward. The days that followed did not feel dramatic. There were no raised voices, no confrontations, no messages demanding explanations, and that absence itself told me everything I needed to know. Because silence, when it comes from people who once filled every space with their presence, is rarely accidental. It is chosen, controlled, and often revealing. And I moved through those days with the same steady rhythm I had carried since leaving the hotel, waking early, reviewing documents, answering calls from the attorney's office, each step unfolding exactly as planned, not rushed, not forced, but deliberate. And with every passing day, the distance between what my life had been and what it was becoming grew more defined, not in visible ways, not yet, but in the decisions I was making quietly, consistently, without seeking approval or explanation. And it was during one of those mornings, as I sat at the kitchen table with the updated documents spread neatly in front of me, that my phone finally rang with a name I had been expecting, Daniel, and I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before answering, not to create tension, but because I needed to meet the moment without reaction, without the weight of old patterns influencing what I would say. I answered calmly, my voice even, and there was a brief pause on the other end, as if he had not expected me to pick up, or perhaps he had expected a different tone, something warmer, something more familiar. Mom, he said, his voice carrying that careful neutrality I had come to recognize. I just wanted to check in, see how you were doing after the party. And I listened to the words, not for what they said, but for what they avoided. There was no mention of the screen, no acknowledgement of the label, no recognition of the moment that had shifted everything. Only a surface-level concern that sounded appropriate without actually addressing anything real. I am doing well, I replied. And the simplicity of that answer seemed to catch him off guard, because he hesitated before continuing, as if searching for the next line in a conversation that no longer followed the script he was used to. That is good, he said. Sophia and I were thinking maybe we could come by this weekend, have dinner, spend some time together. And the invitation was framed casually, almost generously, as if time together were something they were offering rather than something that had once been natural. And I considered it for a moment, not emotionally, but practically, understanding that this was not about connection. It was about maintaining appearances, about ensuring that whatever had been done remained unspoken, contained within a version of events that did not require accountability. This weekend will not work for me, I said, my tone unchanged. And there was another pause, longer this time, more noticeable, as if he had expected agreement, or at least negotiation. But I offered neither. Oh, he replied, we can pick another time. And I could almost hear the shift in his posture, the recalibration of his approach, because something in my response had signaled that the dynamic was no longer what it had been. We will see, I said, not as dismissal, but as a statement of fact, because from this point forward, time would be decided on my terms, not assumed or arranged without consideration, and the conversation ended shortly after, polite, controlled, unresolved, and when I set the phone down, I felt no lingering emotion, no urge to replay what had been said, because the exchange had confirmed exactly what I needed to know, that they were aware something had changed, but they were not yet aware of how much, and that difference mattered. It created space, time, an opportunity to continue what I had started. Without interference, without premature reaction, and I returned to the documents in front of me, reviewing the notes from my attorney, the revisions already in motion, the protections being reestablished, and there was a quiet satisfaction in seeing it all laid out clearly, not as retaliation, not as punishment, but as correction, as a way of ensuring that what I had built would no longer be shaped by assumptions made without my consent. And later that afternoon, I drove to the bank, another place that once felt routine, almost insignificant, but now carried a different weight, because routine, when examined closely, often reveals where control truly lies, and I met with the manager. Privately, discussing accounts, access, permissions that had been granted over time, and as we went through each detail, I made adjustments, small on their own, but meaningful in their accumulation, changes that ensured visibility, that required authorization, that removed the ease with which things had been handled before, and the process was calm, efficient, handled with the same professionalism I had encountered at the law office, and when I left, there was no dramatic sense of victory, only a steady awareness that everything was being brought back into alignment, piece by piece. And as I drove home, the sun beginning to lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the road, I thought briefly about how different this moment would have felt if it had happened years ago, if I had recognized the pattern earlier, if I had acted sooner, but that thought passed quickly, because regret serves no purpose when action is already underway. And what mattered now was not when I had seen the truth, but that I had seen it at all, and that I was responding with clarity rather than hesitation. And when I pulled into my driveway, turning off the engine, I sat there for a moment, not out of uncertainty, but out of recognition, because the quiet life I was returning to looked the same on the surface, unchanged, familiar, but beneath that surface, everything had shifted, decisions were being made, structures were being adjusted, and the effects of those changes would not remain hidden. Forever, they would surface, gradually, unmistakably, and when they did, the version of me they expected to find would no longer exist, and I stepped out of the car, closing the door with a soft, final sound, and walked inside, carrying with me not the weight of what had been done, but the certainty of what was now in motion. It was 3 days later when the first real crack appeared, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable once you knew where to look, and I was sitting at my desk reviewing a set of revised documents when my phone rang again, this time not with Daniel's name, but with Sophia's, and that alone told me something had shifted on their side, because Sophia had never called me directly before, not for anything that mattered, not for anything that required acknowledgement beyond polite gatherings and carefully managed conversations, and I let the phone ring once before answering, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted the moment to arrive fully formed, without interruption from old habits. And when I picked up, her voice came through smooth, composed, but carrying an edge that had not been there before. "Evelyn," she said, using my name instead of any softer title, "we need to talk." And the phrasing itself was telling, not a request, not an invitation, but a statement framed as necessity, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, allowing a brief silence to settle before responding. "What would you like to discuss?" I asked, my tone neutral, steady, and there was a pause on her end, just long enough to reveal that she had expected something else, perhaps defensiveness, perhaps curiosity, but not calm, not distance. And when she spoke again, her words were measured, but less controlled. "We noticed some changes in the accounts," she said, and the way she emphasized the word noticed made it clear that this was not a casual observation. It was concern, growing and uncomfortable. "I see," I replied, offering nothing more, because explanation was no longer something I owed freely. There was another pause, sharper this time, and then she continued, "Daniel and I were not informed about any of this." And there it was, the expectation laid bare, not that something had changed, but that they should have been included in the decision. That access equated to entitlement, and I allowed myself a small moment to consider how naturally that assumption had formed, how easily it had gone unchallenged until now. I am aware, I said simply, and the quiet certainty in my voice seemed to shift something on the other end of the line, because when she spoke again, the control she had maintained began to slip, even if only slightly. Is there a reason for this? She asked, and I could hear the underlying tension, the calculation, the attempt to regain footing in a situation that no longer followed her expectations, and I looked down at the documents in front of me. The signatures, the revisions, the clarity that had replaced years of assumption, and I answered without hesitation, yes, and I did not elaborate, because the reason did not need to be explained in detail. It had already been demonstrated, clearly, publicly, and the silence that followed stretched longer this time, heavy with everything she was choosing not to say directly. And when she finally spoke again, her tone had changed, not softer, but more cautious, more aware. We should probably sit down together, she said, talk through this. Make sure everything is aligned. And the word aligned stood out, because alignment, in her context, had always meant agreement with decisions that were already made, acceptance of structures that benefited her, and I understood that what she was really asking for was a return to the dynamic she was comfortable with, one where I listened, agreed, stepped back, and I let a small breath out before responding. That will not be necessary, I said, and this time, there was no pause, only a sharp intake of breath on the other end, followed by a silence that felt less controlled, less calculated, more reactive. And when she spoke again, the composure was still there, but thinner now, more fragile. Evelyn, she began, as if preparing to explain something, to reframe the situation in a way that would restore her sense of control, but I did not allow the conversation to move in that direction. Everything that needs to be addressed is already being handled, I said, my tone unchanged, not raised, not firm in a way that demanded attention, but steady in a way that left no room for interpretation. And for the first time since the call began, there was no immediate response, only silence, the kind that comes when someone realizes that the position they have relied on is no longer secure, that the structure they assumed was fixed has begun to shift beneath them. And after a few seconds, she ended the call with a brief, controlled goodbye, the kind that signals retreat rather than resolution. And when the line went quiet, I placed the phone down gently on the desk, not with satisfaction, not with triumph, but with a clear understanding that the moment had arrived, not the moment of confrontation, but the moment of awareness, the point at which they began to see that something had changed beyond their ability to manage quietly. And I returned my attention to the papers in front of me, continuing where I had left off, because this was never about reacting to their realization. It was about completing what I had already set in motion. And as the afternoon moved forward, I continued with the same steady focus, reviewing updates, confirming changes, ensuring that every detail was aligned with the direction I had chosen. And later, as I stood by the window, watching the light fade slowly across the street, I allowed myself a brief moment to acknowledge what had just happened, not as a turning point, but as confirmation that the quiet decisions I had made were beginning to surface, that the consequences of those decisions were no longer contained within documents and meetings, but were reaching the people who had once assumed control without question. And I did not feel the need to respond further, to explain, to justify, because the clarity I had gained did not require validation. It required consistency. And as I turned away from the window, the room settling into evening light, I knew that whatever came next would not be shaped by their expectations, but by the steady, deliberate path I had already chosen, one step at a time, without hesitation, without doubt, and without looking back. The following morning did not bring hesitation, it brought movement, and I woke with a clarity that no longer needed to be built, only followed, because the moment Sophia called me the day before had confirmed what I already understood, that the quiet changes I had made were no longer invisible, that the balance they had relied on had shifted just enough for them to feel it. And once something like that is felt, it cannot be ignored. It demands response, and I knew that response would come, not in honesty, not in acknowledgement, but in strategy, and I prepared myself not by reacting, but by continuing exactly as I had planned. I made my coffee, sat at the table, and reviewed the latest updates from my attorney, each note precise, each revision moving things further away from assumption and closer to control. And there was a steadiness in that process that grounded me, because while they were only beginning to realize something had changed, I was already several steps ahead, and that difference mattered. It created space, and space is where decisions take shape without interference. And it was not long before my phone rang again, this time with Daniel's name. And I answered without delay, not because I was eager, but because I no longer needed to prepare for these conversations. They no longer held uncertainty. "Mom," he began, his voice tighter than before, less neutral, less controlled. "I just spoke with Sophia, and I could hear it immediately. The shift from distance to urgency, from careful tone to something closer to concern, maybe even frustration. There are changes happening with the accounts," he continued. And now there was no attempt to soften it, no effort to frame it as casual observation. It was direct, pointed, and I let him speak without interruption, allowing the weight of his words to settle before responding. "Yes," I said, and the simplicity of that answer seemed to unsettle him more than anything else, because it offered no explanation, no justification, only confirmation. "Mom," he said again, this time with a sharper edge, "what is going on?" And I leaned back slightly in my chair, not out of discomfort, but because I recognized the moment for what it was, not a conversation, but an attempt to regain footing, to pull me back into a role where I would explain myself, where I would soften the impact of what I had done. And I had no intention of returning to that role. "What is happening?" I replied calmly, "is that I am reviewing and adjusting my financial and legal arrangements." And I chose each word carefully, not to obscure, but to define, to make it clear that this was not sudden, not emotional, but deliberate. And there was a brief silence on the other end, followed by a measured exhale, as if he were trying to recalibrate, trying to find a way back into familiar territory. "You should have talked to me first," he said. And there it was again, the expectation, the assumption that decisions about what was mine should pass through him. And I let that sit for a moment before answering. "I am talking to you now," I said. And the distinction was subtle but important, because this was not about seeking permission, it was about stating reality. And I could hear the frustration in the way he shifted, the slight change in his breathing, the pause before his next words. "This affects us too," he added. And I did not miss the choice of language. Not "it affects me," not "I am concerned," but us, a collective claim to something that had never been fully theirs. And I considered that carefully, because it revealed more than he intended. It showed how deeply the assumption of shared control had taken root, how naturally it had been accepted. And I responded with the same calm clarity I had maintained throughout. "What belongs to me will be handled by me," I said. And there was no emphasis, no raised voice, just a statement that left no room for reinterpretation. And this time the silence that followed was different, heavier, less controlled, because there was no easy way to redirect it, no familiar pattern to fall back on. And when he spoke again, his tone had shifted once more, not softer, but more cautious, more aware. "We should meet," he said, "talk about this properly." And I could almost see the conversation he was trying to create, the setting, the explanations, the attempt to reframe everything in a way that would restore balance in his favor. And I understood it clearly, but I did not accept it. "That will not be necessary," I replied. And this time there was no hesitation in my voice, no room for negotiation. And I heard the moment it landed, the slight break in his composure, the realization that this was not a temporary adjustment, not something that could be smoothed over with conversation. "Evelyn," he said, and this time he used my name, not Mom. And that change was not lost on me. It was subtle, but it carried weight. It reflected the shift in how he was positioning himself, not as a son appealing to his mother, but as someone trying to negotiate with an equal, or perhaps someone he no longer fully recognized. And I let that moment pass without comment, because it did not need to be addressed. It had already revealed everything it needed to. "I have already made the necessary arrangements," I said. And I let the words settle, not as a challenge, but as a conclusion. And after a long pause, one that stretched just enough to confirm that there was nothing left for him to say in that moment, the call ended, not with resolution, but with the quiet understanding that the conversation had not gone the way he expected. And when I placed the phone down, I did not feel tension, I did not feel the need to revisit what had been said, because the outcome had already been determined long before that call, and I stood up, walking toward the window as I had done the day before, looking out at the same street, the same houses, the same stillness, but everything felt different now, not because the world had changed, but because I had, and I understood that what had begun as quiet adjustments was now becoming visible, tangible, something they could no longer ignore, and that visibility would only increase with time, not all at once, not in a single moment, but in a series of realizations that would come too late for them to undo. And as I stood there, watching the light shift across the pavement, I felt no urgency to move faster, no pressure to escalate, because the path I was on did not require speed, it required consistency. And I had already committed to that, fully, completely, without hesitation, and whatever came next would not change that. It would only reveal how far things had already moved beyond their control. The meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon, and unlike everything that had come before, this was not something that would unfold quietly behind the scenes. This was the point where structure would become visible, where decisions would no longer exist only in documents and private conversations, but in actions that carried immediate weight. And I arrived at the office early, not out of urgency, but because I wanted to be present before anything began, to sit in that space and recognize that what I had set in motion was now reaching its next phase. And when I was led into the conference room, everything was already prepared, folders arranged neatly on the table, documents marked and organized, each detail reflecting the same precision I had come to rely on. And I took my seat without hesitation, placing my hands calmly in front of me, not clasped, not tense, simply resting, because there was nothing left to prepare for, only to confirm. And when my attorney entered, followed by an associate carrying additional files, there was no small talk, no unnecessary exchange, only a brief acknowledgement before we began. And the conversation moved forward with clarity, each document reviewed, each change explained in terms that left no room for misunderstanding. And as I listened, I understood that what we were finalizing was not just a correction of past decisions, but a complete restructuring of how control would function moving forward, access redefined, authority reassigned, oversight restored to where it had always belonged but had gradually been diluted, and I signed each page with the same steady hand, not rushing, not pausing longer than necessary, because each signature was not an emotional act, it was a precise one, a confirmation of something I had already decided. And when the final document was placed in front of me, the one that consolidated everything into a clear, enforceable structure, I read it once more, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to acknowledge fully what it represented, and then I signed it without hesitation, and as the pen left the paper, there was a subtle shift in the room, not dramatic, not outwardly visible, but present, the kind of shift that happens when something moves from possibility to reality, when what was once flexible becomes fixed. And my attorney gathered the documents carefully, placing them into their respective folders, explaining the next steps, the notifications that would be sent, the adjustments that would take effect immediately, and I listened without interruption, because the details mattered, not just in execution, but in understanding how the changes would unfold beyond this room. And when everything was complete, I stood up, smoothing the front of my jacket, the same quiet gesture I had made before, not out of habit, but as part of a transition, and we exchanged a brief nod, professional, contained, marking the end of one process and the beginning of another. And as I stepped out of the building, the air felt different, not lighter, not heavier, simply clearer, as if the uncertainty that had once lingered in the background had been removed entirely. And I walked to my car with the same measured pace, each step grounded in the knowledge that what I had done could not be undone, not by conversation, not by pressure, not by expectation. And as I drove away, I did not think about what they would say when they received the notifications. I did not imagine their reactions, because that was no longer my concern. What mattered was that the structure had changed, permanently, in a way that would not rely on explanation, only on fact. And later that evening, as I sat at home, the quiet once again surrounding me, my phone remained still for longer than it had in days. And I knew that silence would not last, that when it broke, it would come with a different tone, a different urgency, because the changes were no longer theoretical, They were active, affecting accounts, access, decisions that could no longer be made without my direct involvement. And when the phone finally rang, the name that appeared was not Daniel or Sophia, but the bank, confirming that the updates had been processed, that permissions had been adjusted, that everything was now aligned with the new structure, and I acknowledged it with a simple thank you, because confirmation did not require celebration, only recognition. And when the call ended, I placed the phone down and sat back slightly, allowing a moment of stillness to settle, not as reflection, but as acknowledgement. Because what had begun with a single moment of clarity at that anniversary had now reached a point where it existed independently of that moment. It no longer depended on what had been said or done that night. It stood on its own, defined, secured, and as I looked around the room, the same familiar space that had witnessed the beginning of this shift, I understood that everything moving forward would be shaped by this new foundation, not by assumption, not by expectation, but by a clarity that would not allow itself to be overlooked again. And somewhere beyond the quiet of that room, I knew that realization was beginning to reach them, not all at once, not with full understanding, but in fragments, in disruptions, in moments where things did not respond the way they once had, and those moments would build, just as everything else had, until the full picture became impossible to ignore. And when that happened, there would be no conversation that could return things to what they were, because what they were no longer existed, and I remained where I was, calm, steady, not waiting for that moment, not anticipating it, simply allowing it to arrive in its own time, knowing that when it did, it would confirm what I had already accepted, that control, once reclaimed with intention, does not quietly slip away again. It happened 2 days later, not with a warning, not with a gradual lead-in, but with a single moment that made everything unmistakably clear. And I was standing in my kitchen, pouring a cup of coffee, when my phone rang again, and this time I did not need to look at the screen to know who it was, because the timing alone told me that the notifications had reached them fully, not just as numbers on a statement or access denied on a screen, but as a reality they could no longer ignore. And when I answered, Daniel's voice came through immediately, sharper than before, stripped of the careful neutrality he had tried to maintain. "Mom, what did you do?" And there was no greeting, no attempt at composure, only urgency. And I set the coffee cup down slowly, allowing the sound of it touching the counter to settle before I responded. "I made adjustments," I said, and my voice remained even, because nothing about this moment required intensity. Everything had already been decided, adjusted. Daniel repeated, his tone tightening. "The accounts are locked. Transfers are being flagged. I cannot access anything the way I used to." And I listened, not to his frustration, but to the words themselves, the confirmation that what had been changed was now fully visible, fully felt, and I let a brief silence pass before answering. "Access has been updated," I said, and again, I chose clarity over explanation, because explanation invites negotiation, and there was nothing left to negotiate. There was a pause, and then his voice returned, louder this time, not raised in anger, but in disbelief. "You should have talked to me. You should have told me before making changes like this." And I could hear it clearly now, not concern, not confusion, but a sense of entitlement that had been left unchallenged for too long. And I turned slightly, resting my hand against the counter, grounding myself in the simplicity of the moment. "I am telling you now," I replied, and the words were not defensive, they were factual, and for a second, there was nothing on the other end. Just the faint sound of his breathing as he tried to find a response that would bring the conversation back under his control. "This affects everything," he said finally. "Our plans, the investments, the future," and I recognized the shift immediately. The move from access to expectation, from what he could reach to what he believed was already his. And I let that settle before I answered. "What belongs to me is not part of your plans unless I choose it to be," I said. And this time, there was no softness in the statement, not in tone, but in meaning, because clarity does not require volume, it requires precision. And the silence that followed was heavier than before, longer, as if the words themselves had created a space he did not know how to fill. And when he spoke again, his voice had changed, not calmer, but more controlled, more deliberate, as if he were trying to step into a position that no longer felt secure. "Sophia said you refused to meet," he added, as if bringing her into the conversation would shift the balance, as if reinforcing their position would restore something that had already been altered. And I did not respond immediately, because the question behind the statement was not about the meeting. It was about control, about access, about returning to a structure that no longer existed. There is nothing to discuss that has not already been addressed, I said, and the finality of the statement did not come from emphasis, but from the absence of uncertainty. And I heard it then, the moment it registered, the realization that this was not temporary, not something that could be undone with conversation or pressure. And his next words came slower, measured, but carrying a weight that had not been there before. "This is not how families handle things," he said, and I almost smiled, not out of amusement, but out of recognition, because that sentence revealed everything. It was not about fairness, not about respect. It was about maintaining a version of family that allowed certain things to happen without question, without resistance. And I straightened slightly, my voice remaining steady as I responded. "This is how I handle what is mine." And there was no need to say more, because anything beyond that would only return us to a conversation I had already left behind. And for a long moment, there was nothing but silence, the kind that does not invite continuation, the kind that signals the end of what can be said without changing direction entirely. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, not softer, but more distant, as if he were already stepping back, already recalculating. "We will need to figure this out," he said, and I did not correct him, did not explain that there was nothing left to figure out, because understanding does not arrive through explanation. It arrives through experience, through the steady realization that things no longer function the way they once did. And the call ended shortly after, not abruptly, but without resolution, and I placed the phone down gently, returning my attention to the coffee that had cooled in my cup, taking a slow sip as if nothing had changed, because in a way, nothing had. Everything that mattered had already been decided before that call began, and I moved through the rest of the day with the same calm focus, answering a few follow-up messages from my attorney, confirming final details, ensuring that every part of the structure was holding exactly as it should. And as evening approached, I found myself standing once again by the window, looking out at the quiet street, the same view I had seen every day, unchanged, steady. And I understood that while everything inside my life had shifted, the world outside would continue as it always had. And that contrast did not feel unsettling. It felt grounding, because it reminded me that change does not need to be visible to be real. It only needs to be certain. And as the light faded and the street grew darker, I stood there without urgency, without anticipation, knowing that the realization I had reached days ago was now reaching them, not as a single moment, but as a series of disruptions that would continue until the full truth became impossible to ignore. And when that happened, there would be no returning to what they expected, because what they expected no longer existed. And I turned away from the window, leaving the quiet behind me, carrying forward not the weight of what had been lost, but the certainty of what had been reclaimed. It was nearly a week later when everything settled into something that no longer felt like a transition, but a new reality. And the house was quiet in the way it always had been. But now the quiet felt different, not empty, not waiting, but complete, as if something had finally been resolved beneath the surface. And I moved through the rooms with a steady calm, no longer replaying the anniversary, no longer revisiting the conversations that followed, because they no longer held any weight. They had already served their purpose. They had revealed what needed to be seen. And once something is seen clearly, it does not need to be examined again. It simply becomes part of your understanding. And I paused for a moment in the living room, my eyes settling on the same photographs that had once stirred questions, memories of a time when everything felt certain, when I believed that what I had built would always be shared in the way I intended. And I walked over to the shelf, lifting one of the frames carefully, the image of Daniel as a young boy smiling up at me, his expression open, unguarded, and I studied it for a moment. Not with longing, not with regret, but with a quiet acknowledgement that time changes people in ways we cannot always control, that love given freely does not guarantee understanding in return. And I placed the frame back exactly where it belonged, not adjusting it, not turning it away, because the past does not need to be hidden. It only needs to be understood for what it was. And I stepped back, taking in the room as a whole, recognizing that nothing here needed to be removed or replaced, only redefined in meaning. And as I turned toward the kitchen, my phone remained silent on the table, a silence that no longer felt uncertain, because I knew now that whatever came next would not come with the same assumptions, not with the same expectations. And when the call finally did come later that afternoon, it was brief, controlled, Daniel's voice steady, almost formal, as he informed me that they had received full confirmation of the changes, that the accounts were no longer accessible in the way they had been, that the structure had been updated beyond what they had anticipated. And I listened without interruption, allowing him to finish without offering anything in return, because there was nothing left to add. The situation did not require explanation, only acknowledgement. "I understand," I said, and the simplicity of those words seemed to bring the conversation to an immediate close, because understanding, when stated without emotion, leaves no room for argument. And there was a pause on his end, longer than before, as if he were considering something he had not fully accepted until that moment. And when he spoke again, his tone had shifted once more, not defensive, not demanding, but quieter, more distant, as if he were speaking from a place he was still trying to define. "Things are different now," he said, and I did not correct him, did not explain that things had been different for much longer than he realized, because that realization would come on its own, in time, and I responded with the same calm certainty I had carried from the beginning. "Yes, they are," and there was nothing more to say. The call ended without conflict, without resolution, but with a clear understanding that the balance they had once relied on had been permanently altered. And when I placed the phone down, I did not feel the need to revisit it, to analyze the tone or the words, because the meaning was already clear, and I stepped outside onto the back porch, the late afternoon light stretching across the yard, the air still and quiet, and I stood there for a moment, allowing the stillness to settle around me, not as something to fill, but as something to recognize, because for the first time in a long while, everything felt aligned, not because circumstances had improved, but because my understanding of them had. And I realized then that what I had done was not about taking something away. It was about placing it exactly where it belonged, ensuring that what I had built, what I had worked for, what I had trusted others to respect, was now protected by clarity rather than assumption. And that clarity had changed everything, not just in action, but in perspective, in the way I viewed my place in this family, not as something defined by their recognition, but by my own understanding. And I walked slowly along the edge of the porch, my steps unhurried, my thoughts steady, because there was no longer any urgency, no need to prove anything, no need to revisit what had been said or done. The moment that had started all of this, that quiet humiliation displayed on a screen, had not broken anything. It had revealed everything. It had shown me exactly where I stood, and more importantly, it had shown me what needed to change. And I paused at the railing, resting my hands lightly against the wood, looking out over the yard that had remained unchanged through all of this. The same trees, the same grass, the same quiet space that had witnessed years of my life. And I understood that while the setting remained the same, I did not. I had moved beyond the version of myself that accepted without question, that trusted without verification, that stepped back without recognizing the cost. And what replaced that version was not something harsher, not something colder, but something clearer, something that did not rely on others to define its value. And as the sun began to lower, casting longer shadows across the ground, I remained where I was, not waiting for anything, not expecting anything, simply present in a moment that no longer needed to be understood, because everything that mattered had already been made clear. And I turned back toward the house, stepping inside with the same steady calm, knowing that whatever came next would not change what had already been established, that the foundation I now stood on was one I had chosen, defined, and secured on my own, and that was something no one could quietly take away again.